The building was too quiet for a Tuesday night. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace. The kind that lingers heavy, stale, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I could still smell the burnt coffee someone left on the warmer 3 hours ago, bitter and metallic. The overhead lights hummed faintly, one bulb flickering in the hallway outside my office. 45 years in this place, and I knew every sound, every flaw in the wiring, every corner where the carpet still buckled. I'd spent more nights here than I had at home, and yet tonight it felt foreign, almost hostile. My name is Walter Harlan. I am 68 years old, and for nearly half a century I served as Senior Operations Director for a firm called Bexley Industrial Systems. If you've driven across a bridge in this country, odds are some of the steel, wiring, or safety systems came through our supply chains. I had my fingerprints on every line of it. 45 years of results, numbers, deadlines, and crises averted. 45 years of my life in these concrete walls, long after most men my age had retired to fishing boats or golf courses. And then, 3 weeks ago, my supervisor looked me in the eye and said 6 words I will never forget. "You've got no future here, Walter." She said it with a rehearsed calm, like she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror. Her name was Ms. Carter, mid-40s, sharp suits, expensive shoes. The type of manager who thought vision mattered more than grit. She told me the company wanted younger leadership, fresher blood, new energy. Then she smiled, as if she were offering me a gift, not burying a knife in my back. That same day, she introduced my replacement, a boy, 23, maybe 24 at most. Fresh out of school, still soft around the edges, hair slicked back like he'd copied it out of a magazine. He shook my hand with a grip that was both sweaty and limp, and asked me if lunch breaks were mandatory. Mandatory. On his first day. I'd spent decades making sure men twice his age could put food on their tables, and he was worried about whether he had to stay in the building past noon. I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just watched. Watched him fumble through orientation. Watched Ms. Carter beam at him like he was the second coming of leadership. Watched the staff hide their smirks because they knew the truth. They'd seen me fight through breakdowns, negotiate impossible contracts, pull entire departments back from collapse. They knew. But they stayed quiet, because silence keeps you employed. I learned that lesson long ago. So I packed the few things from my desk: photographs of my wife before she passed, a small brass compass I'd carried since my army days, a fountain pen that had signed more contracts than I could count. I slid each into the box with deliberate calm. Ms. Carter stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching me with the satisfaction of someone who thought she had won. I nodded politely, thanked her for the opportunity, and walked past the boy she'd chosen to replace me. He was scrolling on his phone, not even pretending to pay attention. The elevator ride down was the longest 60 seconds of my life. Every number that lit up felt like a reminder. 45 years for them, 1 minute for me. When the doors opened onto the lobby, the night guard gave me a puzzled nod, as though he couldn't quite understand why I was leaving with a box in my arms. Neither could I. Not really. But I didn't stop. Outside, the air was sharp and cool. The parking lot was nearly empty, only a few cars scattered beneath the yellow sodium lights. I set the box gently in the back seat of my Buick and stood there for a moment, staring at the building's dark windows. It looked like any other office in the city, gray and faceless. But I knew better. I knew the arteries of this place. I knew the heartbeat. I knew where the wires ran, where the contracts bled, where the weaknesses lived. They thought I was finished, that I'd just fade into the background like another relic, too old to matter. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, my knuckles pale against the leather. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Not sadness either. What I felt was quieter, colder. The same feeling I had years ago on a rifle range, finger resting on the trigger, waiting for the perfect stillness before release. I turned the key, the engine rumbled, and the radio hissed on low with some forgotten song. I didn't listen. My thoughts were louder. They believed they'd taken everything from me tonight, but they had no idea what they'd given me. Time. And time, in the hands of a man like me, was never mercy. I drove out of the lot without looking back. My silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning. They called me reliable, loyal, a man who knew his job and did it without complaint. That's the story they liked to tell themselves, because it was easier than admitting the truth. I wasn't just a cog in their machine. I was the one who built the damn machine. Every contract that crossed a desk, every data stream that carried numbers from one side of the company to the other, every vendor handshake that kept steel and wiring flowing on time. I had my fingerprints on it. I didn't just work here. I was the system. I remember when Bexley Industrial Systems was nothing but 3 floors in a rented building with thin walls and phones that crackled when it rained. Back then, no one had time for strategy meetings. We had to improvise, keep shipments moving even when suppliers failed. And I was the one who figured out how to reroute an entire delivery chain through 3 states when a strike shut down the main line. I spent nights at my desk with cold coffee and a half-dead lamp, scribbling out plans that kept our lights on when everything should have gone dark. Piece by piece, year by year, I learned where the veins ran. And I never forgot. That boy Carter hired, he didn't understand what he was stepping into. He thought running operations meant barking orders and quoting leadership books. But the real work was buried under layers of code, hidden contracts, and half-broken relationships that only held together because I kept them stitched with quiet phone calls and favors no one remembered asking for. He thought leadership meant picking a suit and standing tall. I knew it meant keeping 12 different fires under control while pretending the room was cool. So when they told me I was done, I didn't rage. I started pulling threads. Small ones at first. Adjustments so subtle no one could see my fingerprints. A vendor invoice delayed here. A data feed rerouted there. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to create questions. And the questions always pointed back to the green kid in his new chair. I could almost see it from my kitchen table, sipping the same bitter brand of coffee I'd brewed for decades. Him at his desk, sweating through his collar, staring at screens he couldn't understand, while Carter leaned over his shoulder, with that brittle smile she wore when she thought she was winning. She would dismiss the errors as teething pains, call them growing lessons, and then laugh them off at meetings. But numbers don't laugh. Systems don't forgive. And when cracks appear, they spread. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about reminding them that every inch of their empire was built on the back of someone who never asked for applause, never needed the spotlight, and never forgot where the weaknesses lay. I'd spent 45 years listening more than speaking, watching more than acting. That kind of patience doesn't vanish because someone decides you've got no future. It just sharpens. There were nights in the early years when I slept under my desk because payroll had to go out at dawn and the system was still choking on mismatched data. Nights when my wife called, asking if I'd be home for dinner, and I told her to leave the plate in the oven. Those dinners went cold, night after night, while I built the backbone of a company Carter and her kind now strutted across, like it was their personal stage. My wife is gone now, buried on a hillside where the grass never seems to grow straight, and I can't help but think how many moments I gave away so this place could thrive. Sacrifices don't fade, they calcify. The boy made his first big blunder 2 weeks in. He tried to renegotiate a supplier contract on his own, thinking the numbers I left behind were inefficient. What he didn't know was that those numbers balanced 3 other agreements behind them, each one tied to delivery penalties that would have sunk us in a day if anyone tampered. He bragged about cutting costs on a Thursday. By Monday, 3 shipments were stalled, and a client was threatening to walk. Carter smoothed it over, or thought she did, but the panic on her face told me she had her doubts. I didn't need to lift a finger for that one. He was already pulling the wrong thread himself, but I made sure to keep the rope tight around him, adjusting the knots so every move he made dragged him deeper. Redundancies shifted just slightly, alerts silenced in the background, so he never saw problems until they were fires. My traps weren't loud. They weren't meant to be. They were meant to show him the difference between a man who knows the system and a boy who only thinks he does. By the end of the month, the laughter in the office hallways had a different edge. People joked about the new kid, whispered about Carter's bold choice, but no one dared say it out loud. They were watching the walls tremble. That night, I drove home under a low sky, headlights carving through drizzle. My house was quiet, still lined with the same photographs, the same silence I'd grown used to. I stepped into the garage, moved past the workbench, and pressed my fingers against the hidden latch behind the breaker box. The panel clicked, and the safe door opened. Inside, everything I had ever built, everything I had ever kept in the shadows, waited for me. Backup drives, paper contracts, records they thought had been deleted, the kind of proof that could burn careers to ash. I placed my hand on the cold metal edge and whispered to the dark, "They want younger leadership? Let them lead into fire." The first collapse came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after I walked out with my box of belongings, the boy tried to oversee a materials order for a bridge retrofit project in Pennsylvania. He signed off without checking the supplier's load capacity, something I had trained coordinators to triple verify before a single invoice cleared. By the time the mistake surfaced, half the steel had been sitting in a yard 3 states away, unfit for the specs. The client was livid. Millions of dollars hung in the balance, and the boy looked like a deer in headlights when reporters asked questions. I knew, because one of the men I still spoke to in shipping sent me a picture of him standing red-faced at the site. It wasn't the last mistake. Within days, he authorized a software patch on the logistics system without understanding the layers of scripts underneath. The update looked clean on paper, but it severed a data feed that tracked compliance checks for hazardous materials. I could almost feel the panic from my kitchen as the compliance office realized 24 trucks were on the highway with incomplete manifests. It took 3 days to clean up the mess. Carter called it a learning experience in the staff briefing, her smile tight, her voice brittle. I almost admired the performance. Almost. I didn't need to sabotage him directly. His arrogance, and hers, were doing the work for me. But I knew how to make the ground shift just enough to turn a stumble into a fall. I made a quiet call to an old client in Chicago, a man who owed me more favors than he'd ever admit. I slipped him a warning. Double-check every figure the new leadership sends. Then, while the boy and Carter were busy trying to plug leaks in Pennsylvania, I triggered a delay in a payment cycle I knew would reach Chicago 2 days late. The client pushed back, hard. Carter smoothed it with promises, but trust doesn't recover from cracks that deep. She still spoke about me in meetings, I'm told. One of the younger analysts sent me a message late at night, a single line. She called you obsolete. Obsolete. As if 45 years of mastery could be replaced by a boy who thought leadership was something you found in a TED Talk. I didn't feel anger when I read it. I felt precision. Because the one thing arrogance always does is blind its host to the knife sliding beneath the ribs. The boy began to sweat. He stayed late, tried to mimic the routines he'd seen me do for decades, but he never understood the rhythm of the system. He didn't know which contracts were delicate enough to shatter with one wrong touch. He didn't understand that some vendors needed patience, while others needed threats disguised as courtesy. He thought everything was numbers on a screen. He couldn't hear the heartbeat behind them. Meanwhile, Carter doubled down. She mocked the old ways, told staff that what I'd built was bloated, inefficient, outdated. She strutted through the office with her heels clicking, like she was stepping on the past. But every time she dismissed the structures I'd left behind, she gave me an opening. I began timing my silent shifts, minor glitches that looked like coincidence. An invoice misfiled, a shipment delayed, an alert system muted for just long enough to spark panic. Each failure struck when Carter was most confident, when she was on calls praising her new hire or laughing at how the dinosaur used to run things. The cracks widened. Phones rang constantly. Clients demanded explanations. Emails stacked in inboxes like sandbags against a rising flood. And still Carter smiled, insisting everything was under control. I watched it unfold like a slow-motion collapse, the kind of failure you can see from the first tremor, but no one else notices until the roof caves in. One evening, as rain tapped against my living room windows, I played back a recording from one of my old contacts in accounting. Carter's voice, brittle and sharp, tearing into a junior employee for not adapting to new systems fast enough. The junior didn't even respond. I could hear the silence, the way silence always carries more weight than words. That silence told me the staff had stopped believing in her. That silence was mine. And then it came. The call I'd been waiting for. My phone buzzed on the table just past midnight. I let it ring until the voicemail kicked in, then listened. Carter's voice was tight, frayed at the edges. She tried to sound professional, but desperation bled through every syllable. Walter, look, I know things ended badly, but we need you. The board is restless. The clients are restless. You know this system better than anyone. If you could just come in, even as a consultant, we could work something out. Please call me back. I sat in the dark, the glow of the phone screen fading against my hand. I played the message again, and again. Each time her voice cracked a little more in my head. Then I pressed delete. Silence filled the room, steady and certain. The kind of silence that isn't surrender. The kind that waits, patient, while the walls close in. I hadn't planned to set foot in that building again. But there comes a time when watching from the shadows isn't enough. You have to stand in the fire just to remind them who lit it. So on a gray morning, thick with drizzle, I walked back through the revolving doors of Bexley Industrial Systems. Not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as something far colder. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Not the steady hum of productivity I'd known for decades, but frantic voices layered over each other, phones ringing without answer, the clatter of shoes on tile. The place had the sour smell of panic, like sweat mixed with paper and burnt coffee. Desks were piled with files nobody knew how to reconcile. Screens glowed red with overdue alerts. Staff darted down the hallways with that tight, brittle energy of people trying to outrun collapse. And then I saw Carter. She stood in the middle of the operations floor, her blazer wrinkled, hair pinned too tight, face pale under the fluorescent lights. She was shouting directions into a headset, though no one seemed to be listening. The young replacement sat slumped at his desk, cheeks hollow, shirt clinging with sweat. His tie was crooked, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He saw me first, and for a moment his mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. In a way, he had. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, silent but heavy enough to draw attention. Conversations faltered, heads turned, people moved aside, unsure if they should greet me or hide. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The weight of my silence filled the room more than shouting ever could. Carter spotted me and stiffened. "Walter," she said, her voice thin, straining to sound in control. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the quiet stretch, the kind of quiet that makes people desperate to fill it. Finally, I said, "Looking at the house I built." The words hung there. A few staff shifted uncomfortably. The boy rubbed his temple, staring at his keyboard, as if he could disappear into it. For a moment, I was pulled back years, standing in desert heat with a rifle in my hands, the air too still, the sun too bright. I remembered the lieutenant who laughed at me for not talking, said silence made me weak. Then the firefight broke out, and it was silence that kept me alive. Counting breaths, listening for the rhythm of enemy fire, waiting until the perfect second to move. The lieutenant didn't make it out of that valley. I did, because silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. I looked back at Carter, her jaw tight, eyes defiant but rimmed with exhaustion. "You've got one chance," I said. My voice was calm, almost conversational. "Let me fix it my way, or watch it burn." She let out a brittle laugh, the kind that cracks under its own weight. "Your way? Walter, your way is what held us back. You can't bully people into working with outdated systems and threats. We're modernizing. We don't need you." The boy found his courage then, though it came out thin and trembling. "Yeah," he added, Things are different now. We'll manage." He tried to smile, but it wilted on his lips. I studied them both, then let my eyes drift across the room. I saw the fear in the staff, the restless tapping of fingers, the way nobody looked certain of anything anymore. They wanted me to lash out, to plead, to argue. But I'd learned long ago that words are wasted on the arrogant, so I gave them none. Instead, I let the faintest smile touch my face, the kind of smile that isn't warmth, but warning. I turned without another word, walked through the gauntlet of wide-eyed employees, and pushed open the doors. The sound of the office chaos dimmed behind me, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain against the glass. They thought silence meant surrender. They didn't understand that silence was the trigger. As the doors closed, I imagined the chain reaction already set in motion. The missing approvals, the delayed transfers, the buried lines of code waiting to ignite. They had mocked the old ways, dismissed the man who built their foundation. Now they would see what happened when the foundation decided it was done, holding them up. I stepped out into the rain, my coat collar turned against the wind, and felt the weight lift. Not because it was over, because the real collapse hadn't even begun. The storm began quietly, the way all storms do. A flicker on the payroll servers, just a few delayed confirmations on Friday morning, nothing anyone would notice until the numbers piled up. Then the numbers multiplied, rolling forward like a tide. By noon, Half the staff's paychecks were locked in limbo, accounts frozen until verification could pass through a system I had rerouted weeks before. Phones started ringing, first in HR, then in finance, and soon the entire floor was flooded with panicked voices asking why they couldn't access their money. That was the opening note, the first violin in the symphony. Vendors were next. Contracts they thought had been renewed were suddenly void. The boy had signed them electronically, but the countersignatures had been redirected, expired quietly, in a hidden folder. Trucks were stopped, shipments stalled, and invoices rebounded like ricochets. I watched from my living room, 3 screens glowing with mirrored feeds I'd kept long after I left. The boy sat at his desk, pale and trembling, hands shaking as he typed frantic emails that solved nothing. Carter stood behind him, barking orders that carried no authority. They were actors on a stage, and I had written the script. By late afternoon, the clients began to pull. Chicago terminated their contract outright. The East Coast Consortium announced a suspension pending investigation. Calls came in from regulators flagging anomalies in the compliance logs. Ghost figures I had planted months before. Whispers of fraud that spread like wildfire once the first inquiry hit the wire. I leaned back in my chair, watching the dominoes fall in sequence, each one set to strike the next with perfect precision. It wasn't chaos to me. It was music. I had spent 45 years tuning this orchestra, every process, every bypass, every secret redundancy built with my own hands. Now, I was conducting its collapse. Each missed payment was a drumbeat, each broken contract a brass horn, each canceled account another chord in a rising crescendo. And at the center of it all, Carter's face grew more ashen by the hour. Her confidence bled away until she looked like a woman standing in a house fire, still insisting the flames were under control. The boy didn't last the day. Before the sun set, he staggered out of the office, tie loose, jacket half-buttoned, muttering to anyone who would listen that he'd been set up. Maybe he even believed it. But the truth was simpler. He was never built for this world. He thought leadership was about being seen. He never understood that real leadership is invisible, silent, and patient. When I walked back into the building the next morning, the air was heavy with defeat. Staff avoided eye contact, whispering in corners. The phones still rang, but fewer people bothered to answer. Carter was in her office, blinds half closed, hair undone, eyes bloodshot. Her desk was littered with papers, contracts, warnings from the board. She looked up when I stepped in, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, she didn't try to smile. "Walter," she said, her voice hoarse. "You did this." I let the silence stretch. Then I stepped closer, laid my hands on the edge of her desk, and met her eyes. "You were right," I said, voice low and steady. "I had no future here." I paused, letting the weight of it settle. "But neither do you." Her face crumpled, not with tears, but with the sudden understanding that she had lost everything. Reputation, authority, the trust of the board, even the boy she thought would be her triumph, had abandoned her, leaving her with nothing but ashes. There was no path back, not for her, not ever. I turned and walked out, leaving her in that office that smelled of failure, the walls closing in tighter with every passing second. My work there was done. On the drive home, the sky cleared, the storm spent. I thought about what had happened, about how quickly a structure can collapse when the foundation decides it's finished carrying the weight. Betrayal is as old as man itself. Every generation thinks it can discard the old for the new, cast aside the builders for the dreamers. They forget that wisdom has teeth. They forget that silence remembers. True revenge isn't rage. Rage burns hot and fast, leaving nothing but smoke. No, true revenge is patience, the kind that waits in the dark, listening, counting breaths, waiting for the exact moment to press a single pressure point and let gravity do the rest. Betrayal writes its own punishment. All it takes is someone who knows where the cracks already live. They called me obsolete. But the future they wanted? I buried it.